So today I want to analyze the issue of once the Prophet passed, Abu Bakr quickly seized power, claimed himself uh, the first caliph, and one of his first acts was seizing all of the Prophet's assets. He denied giving any of those assets to the Prophet's family, particularly his daughter Fatima. Now, the only justification given by Sunni scholars for Abu Bakr's action is one narration, the one here in Sahih al-Bukhari, where the Prophet's wife and the daughter of Abu Bakr says that she heard her father say that he heard the Prophet say that I want my assets to go to charity when I pass. That's it. The wife of the Prophet, whose father just took power and is now the caliph, says she heard her father say that he heard the Prophet say this. Now, we know in present times there's always some conflicts of interest between a wife of a husband and their children, and maybe, the division of assets. But nevertheless, the Prophet, despite knowing that someday he wouldn't be around, only chose, he didn't choose to write this down, he didn't choose to say any of this to any of the other companions. The only one who heard him saying this is the father of his wife, who just took power and became caliph. And that's it. This is the only document, this is the only evidence that any Sunni scholar brings for this action. Now, is there any other precedent of any other prophet in history who dictated to his followers that when they pass, they want all of their assets to go to charity? The answer is no. This is the only case where a prophet specifically, supposedly said, when I die, I want my assets to go to charity. Then, in this very, very weak, ambiguous narration, it doesn't give any instructions. What does that mean, charity? I mean, there wasn't exactly a well-defined organization, a well-defined way. I mean, how does that work exactly? So no instructions. Just don't worry about it, children of the Prophet. We got this. We'll take all the assets and we'll manage it, because we heard him say it. No other companion, not even the daughter of the Prophet, was aware of this. One would think that if the Prophet was intent on this happening, he would have at least informed his children of this. But that's not the case here. Now, what does the Quran say about passing inheritance? There are several mentions in the Quran of prophets passing inheritance. One here in chapter 19, verse 6, regarding the Prophet Zakaria. Now, Sunni scholars will say that the Prophet meant that they would inherit his prophethood, or his closeness to God, some sort of spiritual inheritance. But that's not what it says. It says, "Who will inherit me? Inherit from the family of Jacob." There is another mention of inheritance in chapter 27, verse 16, where Solomon inherits David. So, David passed all of his belongings to his son Solomon, including his prophethood. And then in the Bible, you have another incident where Job in Job chapter 42, verse 15, where not only did Job's family inherit, but his daughters inherited, which was something new at that time for daughters to inherit and receive inheritance if there were sons. Let's look at other narrations by the Prophet himself on the issue of inheritance. Here in Bukhari, it says that a man possessing wealth came to the Prophet and said, "There is none to inherit me except only one daughter. Should I give 2/3 of my property as charity?" The Prophet said, "No." I said, "Should I give half of my property to charity?" The Prophet said, "No." The man said, "Should I give 1/3 to charity?" And the Prophet said, "To leave your heirs rich." No, the Prophet said, "Give 1/3 to charity." And that is quite enough. That's like more than enough. To leave your heirs rich is better than to leave them poor, begging from people, that you would never incur an expense seeking therewith the pleasure of Allah, but you would be rewarded there even for a morsel of food that you put in the mouth of your wife. So here, a rich man is saying, "I have plenty of money, I have one daughter." And the Prophet he's saying, "I want to give it all to charity." But the Prophet is saying, "No, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Make sure you give it to your family so that they're not begging, they're not poor." So, I mean, it just seems like something so contradictory where the Prophet would say to everybody else, "Make sure you give charity to your family," but this burden would only be on him as a prophet. I have a hard time finding the logic in that. The prophets do so much throughout their lifetime for religion. What is the moral and Islamic benefit of them giving whatever little belongings they had to charity? Why wasn't it mentioned in any other document? And why is the Prophet here telling his followers a different narrative? There is no other prophet known to have actually given his assets upon death to charity and not to their heirs. Now, what was the asset that Abu Bakr was insistent on taking control of and not giving to his heirs? It was a land called Fadak that was 160 kilometers, 100 miles large. We're not talking about, a couple of clothing items. We're talking about a very large piece of land with abundant water sources, date palms, and lush gardens. Okay. So it just seems very, very unrealistic that such a prized asset at that time in 7th century Arabia that has dates, that has water, that's 100 miles large, that the Prophet would only give instructions to one companion who just so happened to take the caliphate in a very strange way, and whose daughter was the wife of the Prophet, and deny his family of such a vast piece of land. I mean, and it's interesting that after the death of the Prophet, he had a ring that the Prophet used to use to seal documents. And for some reason, Abu Bakr didn't find this to fall within this inheritance. Only the land. The land was to be taken, but Abu Bakr decided to keep his ring and use it, supposedly as a way to seal documents. But he wasn't the Prophet, so why is he sealing the documents with the Prophet's ring? And then this ring was passed to Omar, and then it was passed to Uthman. And when it came to the time of Ali to become, who took, was the fourth caliph, magically this ring falls into a well, where Uthman said that it fell into a well. So it's very interesting that the one prized possession of the Prophet was taken on some very flimsy evidence, um, by a caliph who just sort of pronounced himself caliph in a very uh, rushed way, with only a couple of his close associates around him. Even though the Quran says different about inheritance, even though there's other narrations of the Prophet saying that one should pass inheritance to their children, to their family, who had some sort of conflict of interest, being that his daughter was the wife of the Prophet, but doesn't decide to give his ring to charity. Decides to keep the ring. Um, why didn't he make his own ring to seal documents? He could have auctioned the ring and given the money to charity. Why did he keep his ring? And oddly, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman, who all had issues with the family of the Prophet, and Imam Ali in particular, when it comes time for him to assume the caliphate, the ring magically gets lost in a well. So I find this whole uh, situation of usurping the Prophet's land and denying his family their share is highly suspicious. I don't see any legitimate justification in Sunni documentation as to why this decision was made. But you as the viewer of the video can make your own decisions. I'm just here to do research and provide the evidence. Thank you.